December 17th, 1944. 05:30 hours. Honsfeld, Belgium. The Tiger tank shuddered once, then its massive Maybach engine gave a final wheeze and went silent. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper struck the edge of the turret in frustration, the sharp clang slicing through the frozen pre-dawn stillness. Inside the cramped compartment, his driver, Unterscharführer Fubel, twisted the ignition again and again, the starter whining uselessly. The fuel gauge trembled against the empty mark. "Reserves dry too, Herr Obersturmbannführer," came the driver's strained voice, tight with disbelief. Peiper climbed down from his command tank, the soles of his boots cracking through the frost-hardened soil of Belgium. Before him stretched the lifeless heart of his armored spearhead. 67 Tiger and Panther tanks, 149 half-tracks, and nearly 5,000 of the Waffen-SS's finest, frozen not by enemy fire, but by the absence of a single drop of fuel. The fog of early morning curled low over the still forms of war machines that only hours before had thundered through the Ardennes. Peiper's eyes fixed on the ghostly outline ahead. The village of Honsfeld, an abandoned American supply post once held by the U.S. 99th Infantry Division. The GIs had withdrawn in haste, leaving chaos in their wake. Fires smoldering in metal drums, half-finished breakfasts on mess tables, and steam still rising from tin mugs of coffee. And then Peiper saw them. Rows upon rows of olive-drab jerry cans, gleaming faintly in the dim light. An impossible sight. Thousands of them, standing like an offering from the gods of war. His adjutant, Hauptsturmführer Hans Gruber, cracked one open, inhaling the sharp scent of American high-octane gasoline before shouting to the men. A sudden frenzy followed. Fuel hoses snaking, engines roaring back to life one by one. Peiper moved among the stacked cans, mentally tallying the numbers. 50,000 gallons, enough to drive his entire Kampfgruppe to the Meuse River, perhaps even to change the fate of the offensive itself. The Americans had left behind in this single depot more fuel than many German divisions had seen in half a year. Yet as Peiper watched his men eagerly refueling under the pale Belgian dawn, a heavy thought took hold, pressing down as thickly as the fog itself. If their advance depended on the enemy's leftovers, perhaps the war was already lost. If the Americans could simply walk away from such staggering quantities of fuel, leaving behind what Germany would have defended with entire divisions, then perhaps this war's outcome had already been sealed. It wasn't just a tactical blunder, it was a profound failure to grasp who their enemy truly was. 6 months earlier, long before Peiper's discovery at Honsfeld, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, had laid the truth bare in a report to the Führer. Dated June 1944, it was a document that should have halted every German offensive plan in its tracks. The report detailed the collapse of Germany's synthetic fuel program, the very bloodstream of the Wehrmacht's war machine, under relentless Allied bombardment. The Leuna works, once producing 175,000 tons of fuel in April, had been reduced to a mere 5,000 tons by September. Hydrogenation plants at Pöhlitz, Bühlen, and Brux, once vital to sustaining operations, were limping along at less than 10% capacity. The statistics painted an unambiguous portrait of decline. That same year, the United States had pumped an astonishing 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil, while Germany, even after counting every drop of synthetic fuel and what little came from the captured Romanian fields, managed only about 33 million barrels, a mere 2% of American output. The Reich was fighting a mechanized war with the logistics of a bygone century, its armored columns fed by horse-drawn wagons while its enemy rolled forward on rivers of oil. Major Friedrich Simmon of the Wehrmacht's logistics branch had coldly calculated that the Ardennes offensive would require at least 4.5 million gallons of fuel to reach Antwerp. Hitler had allocated 5 million, yet barely half ever made it to the front due to shattered railways and bombed-out roads. Germany's grand offensive depended entirely on seizing Allied stockpiles, an act of desperation masquerading as strategy. Across the lines, the Americans were building an empire of supply. The Pluto Project, the pipeline under the ocean, carried fuel directly from Britain to the continent, while the Red Ball Express, a fleet of thousands of trucks, hauled 2,500 tons of cargo every single day to the front. By December 1944, U.S. forces in Europe were burning through 1.2 million gallons of fuel daily and still stockpiling more, receiving 1.4 million gallons each day. They fought while growing stronger. Joachim Peiper understood this bitterly well. At 29, already a Knight's Cross holder with oak leaves and swords, one of the youngest regimental commanders in the Waffen-SS, and a hardened veteran of the Eastern Front, he knew the unspoken truth of modern war. Battles were not won by courage or steel, but by gasoline. His Kampfgruppe had been chosen as the Schwerpunkt, the decisive spearhead of the entire Ardennes offensive. On December 14th, 2 days before the attack was set to begin, Joachim Peiper attended the final briefing in Tondorf. General Sepp Dietrich, commander of the 6th SS Panzer Army, didn't waste words. "You will have enough fuel to reach the Meuse," he said flatly, "if you capture American supplies." It was less a promise than a warning. Peiper's entire fuel allocation amounted to 31,000 gallons, barely enough for 50 miles of combat maneuvering, while the distance to the Meuse River was 65. The arithmetic of failure had been built into the plan from the very start. As dawn approached on December 16th, Peiper's column of tanks and half-tracks prepared to advance. His orders were explicit. Tanks would move in single file to minimize fuel use. Engines were to be shut off during any halt longer than 5 minutes. And the seizure of Allied fuel dumps was to take precedence over all other objectives. Victory itself would depend on scavenging the enemy's abundance. Across the lines, the Americans operated in a different world entirely. That same morning, Captain James Rose of the U.S. 743rd Tank Battalion, stationed just 20 miles from Peiper's starting position, made a routine entry in his unit's logbook. Received fuel resupply, 8,000 gallons. Third delivery this week, storage tanks full. The contrast could not have been more striking. At 0530 hours on December 16, 1944, the German artillery opened Operation Watch on the Rhine with a thunderous barrage that hurled more shells in 2 hours than the Wehrmacht had once allotted for entire campaigns earlier in the war. Yet beneath the spectacle, shortages gnawed at every level. Peiper's armored column began to move at 0700, already behind schedule. The routes marked as highways on German maps turned out to be narrow, rutted farm roads, slick with frost and mud. Within hours, the advance had dissolved into chaos. Massive tanks, meant for the wide plains of Russia, jammed into the twisting lanes of the Ardennes. At Lanzereth, their first objective, they met stubborn resistance from an American reconnaissance platoon, just 18 men, who fought with such ferocity that they held up Peiper's entire armored force for nearly 10 hours. Engines idled as the battle dragged on, precious fuel evaporating into the cold air. By the time the Germans finally overran the position and reached Honsfeld at dawn on December 17th, they had advanced only 20 miles, while consuming nearly 40% of their fuel reserves. At that pace, Peiper knew grimly they wouldn't even make it halfway to the Meuse before running dry. The American supply depot at Honsfeld wasn't even a major installation. It was merely a forward fuel point for the U.S. 99th Infantry Division, officially classified as a Class 3B temporary depot. Yet what Peiper's men stumbled upon there surpassed the monthly fuel allocation of an entire German Panzer division. Hauptsturmführer Hans Gruber would later recall, "We found pyramids of jerry cans, each holding 5 gallons of gasoline. They were stacked nearly 3 meters high and stretched for at least 200 meters. The sheer abundance was surreal." Even more astonishing, the Americans hadn't bothered to destroy the stockpile before retreating. The captured fuel was premium grade, high-octane aviation gasoline mixed with 80-octane motor fuel or better. Ironically, it was almost too pure for German machinery. The Maybach engines powering the Tigers and Panthers had been built for 74-octane fuel. The superior American gasoline caused sputtering, backfiring, and mechanical issues in several tanks. As the refueling continued, more discoveries surfaced. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann, who had once worked in his father's import business and could read English, combed through the depot office and found stacks of shipping manifests. The papers traced the fuel's journey, refined in Texas, shipped to New York, sent across the Atlantic to Liverpool, then ferried across the Channel to Normandy, and finally trucked over 400 miles inland to Honsfeld, a 6,000-mile logistical chain completed in less than 6 weeks. I showed the documents to Obersturmbannführer Peiper, Hoffman recalled decades later in a 1976 interview. He read them twice, then crushed them in his hand. He didn't say a word, but his face turned white. We both knew what it meant. Private Ernst Karras, rummaging through the barracks, uncovered a stack of Stars and Stripes newspapers dated December 15th, just 2 days old. The front page announced the opening of a new fuel pipeline from Cherbourg to Verdun, capable of pumping 300,000 gallons per day. One single pipeline, supplying more fuel daily than Peiper's entire Kampfgruppe would consume during the whole offensive. To grasp the weight of Peiper's realization, one must understand the state of Germany's fuel crisis by late 1944. Since May, relentless Allied bombing had crippled synthetic production by 90%. The Luftwaffe was grounding aircraft not for lack of pilots but for lack of gasoline. Flight training for new recruits had been slashed from 250 hours to barely 60. The Kriegsmarine's surface fleet had largely ceased to exist, its ships rusting in harbor, not from battle damage, but from empty fuel tanks. Germany's fuel starvation by late 1944 had reached absurd extremes. U-boats were fitted with snorkels so they could remain submerged longer and conserve diesel by relying on batteries. At home, private car traffic had vanished since 1942. Gasoline was so scarce that the Gestapo investigated thefts of single liters on the black market, and farmers across the Reich had returned to using horse-drawn plows. In stark contrast, the United States was producing 67% of the world's oil supply. The East Texas oil field alone pumped more petroleum than all of German-occupied Europe combined. American refineries ran at such excess capacity that Standard Oil began experimenting with new petroleum byproducts simply to make use of the surplus crude. With the 50,000 gallons captured at Honsfeld, Peiper's armored column surged forward once more. By noon on December 17th, they had reached Bullingen, seizing more supplies, food, ammunition, and, crucially, detailed maps marking other American fuel depots scattered throughout the region. But those maps revealed a grim reality. The Allies were swimming in fuel. Every crossroads, every village seemed to have a stockpile. The U.S. First Army alone maintained over 3.5 million gallons in reserve. Peiper pressed on toward Ligneuville, where the offensive would take a dark turn. There, his men committed the Malmedy massacre, executing 84 American prisoners of war, a decision Peiper would later claim was driven, in part, by desperation. He insisted he could not spare the gasoline to transport captives. By evening, his vanguard reached Stavelot, home to one of the largest American fuel depots in Belgium, over 2 million gallons stored across 15 acres. Enough, Peiper thought, to carry his Kampfgruppe to the Meuse and beyond. But the Americans were ready. Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had received advance warning of the approaching German armor. His orders were short and absolute: deny the fuel to the enemy at any cost. The depot contained precisely 289,000 gallons of gasoline, stored in jerry cans stacked 3 meters high in endless rows. At 16:30, as the first German vehicles appeared at the outskirts, Brewster gave the signal. His engineers soaked the ground with gasoline, creating trails between the stacks. White phosphorus grenades were distributed down the line. Technical Sergeant Paul Solis pulled the pin on the first one and hurled it. The explosion was instant and immense, he recalled years later, an inferno that roared skyward, consuming the horizon in flame and black smoke. A wall of flame erupted, soaring more than 100 feet into the air. Within moments, the entire Stavelot depot was engulfed in a roaring inferno. When Peiper's lead tanks crested the ridge, they were met not by the promise of fuel but by a pillar of black smoke that climbed 1,000 feet skyward, blotting out the winter sun. The blaze raged for 3 days, consuming enough gasoline to have driven Peiper's entire division to Antwerp and back again. Unterscharführer Föbel later described the moment with quiet disbelief. The Obersturmbannführer stood on his turret, watching the flames. He said nothing for perhaps 5 minutes. Then he climbed down and told me, "They can afford to burn 2 million gallons just to keep us from using it. What are we doing here?" Across the Ardennes, the same scene repeated itself. American engineers destroyed depot after depot rather than risk capture. At Trois Ponts, 1.1 million gallons went up in smoke. At Spa, another 2.5 million. In the first week alone, U.S. forces deliberately incinerated over 8 million gallons of gasoline, more than Germany had allotted for the entire Ardennes offensive. This casual destruction revealed the true scale of American power, a supply system so vast it could annihilate what the Germans would have died to preserve. The Red Ball Express symbolized that abundance, 6,000 trucks running day and night, carrying 412,000 tons of supplies. Each vehicle guzzled 40 gallons daily, meaning the operation itself burned more fuel than German Army Group B received in a month. By December 1944, the motor transport service had expanded to 230 truck companies following color-coded routes across liberated Europe, delivering 20,000 tons of supplies every day, 3,000 tons of it fuel. Colonel James Snyder, Chief Logistics Officer of the U.S. First Army, wrote in his December 18th report, "Fuel receipts, 147,000 gallons. Fuel issued, 1,693,000 gallons. Net gain to reserves, 24,000 gallons." Even amid full-scale combat, the Americans were growing stronger. Beneath the earth, an invisible miracle pulsed. Operation Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean, had laid undersea pipes across the English Channel, pumping 1 million gallons daily from Britain to France. From there, a network of inland lines carried fuel ever eastward. The Cherbourg-Paris route delivered 800,000 gallons a day. The Seine line, another 650,000. By December 1944, Allied forces in northwest Europe were burning 7.5 million gallons daily while receiving 8.2 million, fighting a war of movement while still expanding their reserves. Meanwhile, Peiper's advance through Belgium grew ever more desperate. On December 18th, his Kampfgruppe captured yet another small depot near Stoumont. But 5,000 gallons vanished in just 3 hours of fighting. The monstrous Tiger tanks devoured 2.5 gallons per mile in combat. The Panthers burned 1.5. In the steep, frozen terrain of the Ardennes, consumption surged by 40%. Hauptsturmführer Otto Dinkel, maintenance officer for the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, recorded the grim arithmetic. By noon on December 18th, we had consumed 67,000 gallons since the offensive began. Fuel, once the fire of conquest, was now the weight dragging them toward defeat. We had captured perhaps 55,000 gallons, Hauptsturmführer Otto Dinkel later wrote. But we were burning fuel faster than we could seize it. We were operating at a deficit. On the other side of the lines, the Americans were listening. Ultra-intercepts of German radio traffic revealed the dire state of Peiper's supply situation. General Courtney Hodges, commanding the U.S. First Army, immediately issued a directive. Enemy critically short of fuel. Destroy all gasoline stocks threatened by capture. That same day, American C-47 transport planes completed 316 sorties to the besieged town of Bastogne, dropping supplies, including 160,000 gallons of fuel. In one afternoon, the U.S. Army Air Forces had flown more fuel to a surrounded garrison than Peiper's entire Kampfgruppe possessed for its offensive. By December 19th, as Peiper's tanks clashed with American defenders at Stoumont, the crisis reached its breaking point. Vehicles were being abandoned not because of enemy fire, but because their fuel tanks had run dry. Peiper ordered what little gasoline remained, perhaps 8,000 gallons, to be pooled together. It would be enough for one final engagement or for withdrawal, but not both. Meanwhile, Allied logistics officers were already planning for January operations. Brigadier General Maurice Gilland requested 245 million gallons of fuel for the coming month. The request was approved without debate, as routine as ordering rations. The disparity between the two sides went beyond sheer quantity. It was structural. The Americans had standardized their entire vehicle fleet for simplicity and efficiency. A Sherman tank consumed roughly 0.8 gallons per mile. A German Tiger devoured 2.5. U.S. trucks averaged 8 miles per gallon even when fully loaded, and interchangeable parts made maintenance effortless. In contrast, the Germans operated a chaotic mixture of machines, captured French tanks requiring one type of oil, Soviet trucks another, and home-built German vehicles demanding yet more specialized fuel and parts. Every difference compounded the logistical nightmare. On December 20th, Peiper received the message he dreaded. Fuel convoy destroyed by Allied aircraft. No resupply possible. Continue with available resources. He gathered his officers in the dim interior of a farmhouse near La Glaise. Sturmbannführer Werner Pötschke was blunt. We have fuel for 20 kilometers. The Meuse is 30. According to Hauptsturmführer Gruber's later testimony, Peiper looked around the table before speaking quietly. Gentlemen, he said, we are fighting an enemy who burns more fuel to deny it to us than we received for this entire operation. What we captured at Honsfeld, which once seemed a miracle, is nothing to them. We cannot win. The truth of that statement echoed across the front. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, later admitted, "When I learned the Americans had destroyed 8 million gallons rather than risk our capturing it, I knew the offensive was lost before it began." Colonel Friedrich von der Heydt, captured on December 23rd, told his interrogators with weary resignation, "Your soldiers throw away chocolate. My men haven't seen chocolate in 2 years. You burn millions of gallons. We measure by the liter. How can we fight such abundance?" By December 21st, Peiper's once proud column lay trapped at La Glaise. His tanks stood silent, their steel hulks rimed with frost, surrounded by the U.S. 30th Infantry Division, the 82nd Airborne, and the 3rd Armored Division, American units whose combined fuel allocation for that single day amounted to 340,000 gallons. Peiper had perhaps 1,000. The offensive that had begun with fire and thunder was ending in cold silence. Private First Class Richard McKinney wrote home with a mix of disbelief and humor. "We've got Germans surrounded who ran out of gas. Our captain jokes that we burn more fuel making coffee than they have for their tanks." His words captured the absurd imbalance of the war's final winter, an era when American industry had turned warfare itself into an act of production. General Patton's Third Army, for instance, executed a massive pivot north to relieve Bastogne, a maneuver that required 350,000 gallons of fuel merely to redeploy its divisions. What German planners would have dismissed as impossible was completed in just 3 days. On December 23rd, the weather cleared, and the skies filled with the roar of Allied aircraft. Over 2,000 sorties were flown that day, each one consuming fuel at a rate that would have grounded the Luftwaffe for weeks. P-47 Thunderbolts burned roughly 300 gallons per hour. B-26 Marauders, around 200. In a single day of operations, the Allies expended more fuel than Germany had allocated for its entire Ardennes offensive. That night, December 23rd into the 24th, Joachim Peiper made the final decision. With his column encircled and immobile, he ordered the abandonment of all vehicles. Of the 119 tanks and assault guns that had begun the advance, 39 remained intact but out of fuel. They were destroyed with the last of the ammunition to prevent capture. Oberreiter Heinz Goals later recalled, "We siphoned the last drops from every vehicle, perhaps 200 gallons in all." The Obersturmbannführer personally placed the charges beneath his own command tank. Millions of Reichsmarks worth of equipment destroyed because of empty fuel tanks. Out of the 5,000 men who had begun the offensive with Kampfgruppe Peiper, roughly 770 made it back to German lines. They had advanced 60 miles, seized several American depots, and uncovered a truth more devastating than any defeat in battle. The enemy's power lay not only in its armies, but in its limitless capacity to fuel them. News of Peiper's discovery spread quickly through the German High Command. On December 26th, Field Marshal Walter Model received the compiled reports of captured and destroyed American fuel. His chief of staff noted the reaction in his diary. The Field Marshal read the quantities twice: 50,000 gallons captured at Honsfeld, 2 million burned at Stavelot, 8 million destroyed elsewhere rather than left for us. He said quietly, "We are not fighting the same war." 2 days later, on December 28th, Speer attempted once again to confront Hitler with the truth. Hitler insisted the reports were Allied propaganda, Speer later wrote. When shown photographs of the burning Stavelo depot, he said they were staged, Hollywood fabrications. But the men at the front no longer believed such delusions. Wilhelm Hoffmann, writing to his wife from the ruins of the Ardennes, put it simply, "The Americans destroy more fuel in a day than we receive in a month. They drive their tanks as we march on foot. This war is lost." The fuel crisis was not merely a logistical failure, it was a symbol of a larger reality. By 1944, the United States accounted for half of the world's manufacturing output. Its factories produced a new aircraft every 5 minutes, a new ship every day, and a new tank every 7 minutes. In petroleum alone, the contrast was staggering. The United States produced 1.8 billion barrels of oil annually. The Soviet Union, 110 million. Germany, counting synthetic fuel, 33 million. Japan, just 2.6 million. In a world at war, America had become not just the arsenal of democracy, but the engine of history itself. The combined petroleum output of all Axis powers amounted to less than 2% of America's. Every German offensive after 1942 had been shaped and strangled by fuel shortages, while every American advance surged forward on tides of abundance that German planners could scarcely imagine. Lieutenant Colonel Chester Hansen recorded a telling moment on December 27th. A logistics officer reported that poor weather had reduced fuel deliveries to only 500,000 gallons per day. For a moment, there was concern, until someone pointed out that even this reduced figure exceeded Germany's total allocation for the entire Ardennes offensive. To the German prisoners captured in the Bulge, it wasn't American firepower that stunned them most. It was American waste. They watched U.S. soldiers toss away half-eaten rations, burn gasoline to heat tents, or drive vehicles for convenience rather than necessity. Such casual excess broke morale in ways artillery never could. Obergefreiter Reichhelm told his interrogators, "We knew your production numbers in theory, but seeing your soldiers throw away more than we possessed made those numbers real. Every man who witnessed it understood the war was lost." Despite strict censorship, that understanding crept home through letters. Feldwebel Ernst Müller wrote to his wife, "Americans wash their clothes in gasoline. They feed chocolate to their dogs. They fire artillery for Christmas. We cannot fight infinity." For many, the psychological blow was shattering. The myth of German racial superiority withered before the undeniable evidence of American material power. How, they wondered, could a supposedly decadent society command such limitless wealth while the self-proclaimed master race scraped for every liter of fuel and every crust of bread? At the Nuremberg trials years later, German generals would return again and again to logistics, and particularly fuel, as the ultimate factor in defeat. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel admitted, "We possessed operational superiority in 1940 and 1941. By 1944, we could not move our armies for lack of fuel, while the Americans shifted theirs like chess pieces." Even Joachim Peiper, standing trial for the Malmedy massacre, gave testimony that revealed more than he intended. Every decision after December 17th was driven by fuel shortages. We couldn't maneuver, pursue, or retreat effectively. The Americans moved freely while we counted every liter. General Heinz Guderian summarized it most bluntly. When Peiper captured 50,000 gallons, everything to him, nothing to the Americans, the war was over. The story of Peiper's march through the Ardennes endures because it marked the moment industrial warfare reached its inevitable conclusion. Wars were no longer decided by valor or tactical brilliance, but by factories, oil fields, and production ledgers. The romantic vision of the warrior died among the snow and burnt-out tanks of Belgium. As historian Richard Overy would later calculate, by 1944, the Allied to Axis production ratio exceeded 5-to-1 in nearly every major category, and in petroleum, the gap approached 50-to-1. No amount of discipline, training, or ideology could overcome such arithmetic. America built 324,750 aircraft during the war. Germany managed 119,907. The United States rolled out 80,410 tanks to Germany's 46,857. Yet the most decisive figure was not measured in steel or armor. It was oil. In 1944 alone, American refineries produced 1.8 billion barrels of petroleum, while Germany struggled to cobble together a mere 33 million. On December 24, 1944, as Peiper and his surviving men slipped through American lines on foot, abandoning 39 tanks, 70 half-tracks, and 107 other vehicles, the full magnitude of the imbalance came into focus. They had once believed their capture of 50,000 gallons at Honsfeld to be a miracle. Now they understood it was meaningless against an enemy who could burn millions without hesitation. Unterscharführer Föbel would later reflect in a 1975 interview. That morning at Honsfeld, when we found the fuel, we celebrated like men who had won the lottery. By evening, after learning of Stavelot burning, we realized we had already lost. The Americans had so much they could destroy what we would die to possess. The 50,000 gallons that had seemed salvation was, in truth, less than a single American armored division consumed in 2 days, and less than the Red Ball Express burned in just 3 hours. In the scale of Allied operations, it was a rounding error. Major General J. Lawton Collins later wrote, "The Germans' desperate hunt for fuel revealed their fundamental miscalculation. They believed we valued gasoline as they did, as something irreplaceable. They never grasped that we had so much we could burn millions rather than surrender the smallest tactical advantage." Operation Watch on the Rhine collapsed under the immutable arithmetic of industrial war. The entire German offensive consumed roughly 2.8 million gallons. 40% of it scavenged from captured stocks. In that same span, American forces used 267 million gallons, nearly 100 times more. The Wehrmacht lost 100,000 men, 800 tanks, and 1,000 aircraft. Yet its most devastating loss was intangible, the shattering of illusion. Every German who saw the scale of American abundance understood that Germany was no longer waging a war. It was witnessing its own execution. Joachim Peiper survived, imprisoned until 1956 for war crimes. On July 14, 1976, he was murdered at his home in Traves, France, by unknown assailants. But years earlier, in a 1967 interview with historian Henry Lehman, he offered a haunting reflection. Finding that depot was the worst thing that ever happened. If we had run out of fuel earlier, we might have withdrawn with honor. Instead, we learned the truth, that the Americans had oceans and we had drops. We discovered impossibility. The lesson endures far beyond the Ardennes. In the age of industrial warfare, logistics eclipse tactics, and production outweighs valor. Abundance itself becomes a weapon. The German soldier of 1944 may have been better trained and more seasoned, but it no longer mattered. Against America's inexhaustible industrial engine, a machine capable of wasting more than Germany could ever produce, skill, courage, and sacrifice were rendered irrelevant. This truth was written in every jerry can at Honsfeld, every gallon sacrificed to the flames at Stavelot, and every mile of pipeline stretching across France. Wars between industrial powers were no longer contests of battlefield genius. They were struggles of factories, refineries, and supply chains. Colonel Trevor Dupuy later calculated that in December 1944, each American soldier at the front was sustained by 67 pounds of supplies every day. Each German received barely 3. Americans grumbled about inefficiency and waste. To the Germans, that waste was a vision of impossible wealth. 4 decades later, in 1984, veterans from both sides gathered at L'Église. There, the museum preserved one of Peiper's Tiger tanks, still resting where it had sputtered to a halt, its engine long silent, its fuel tank bone dry. Standing beside the steel relic were 2 old soldiers, former Unterscharführer Karl Wortmann of Peiper's unit and former Staff Sergeant Roy Anderson of the U.S. 30th Infantry Division. Anderson gestured toward the tank and said, "We always wondered why you stopped. We thought it was tactical." Wortmann gave a bitter laugh. "We stopped because the tanks were empty," he replied. "You burned millions of gallons to keep it from us. How could we fight that?" Anderson was silent for a moment before answering softly, "We never knew you were that short. We had so much we never even thought about it." That quiet exchange captured the essence of December 1944. Two armies divided not merely by ideology or command, but by scale. One measured its war in gallons, the other in millions. One fought for every jerry can, the other burned oceans. The outcome was inevitable long before the first tank rolled. German records testify to the futility. From the War Diary of Army Group B, December 1944, December 16th, offensive begins. Fuel, 70% of minimum required. December 17th, Peiper captures 50,000 gallons. December 18th, multiple depots destroyed. Over 5 million gallons lost. December 19th, fuel critical, several units immobilized. December 24th, Peiper abandons vehicles, fuel exhausted. Across the lines, the U.S. First Army's figures told the opposite story. December 16th, reserves, 3.7 million gallons. December 17th, 2.2 million destroyed. December 18th, 1.8 million received. December 24th, reserves, 4.1 million. The Americans treated millions as expendable. The Germans guarded every can as treasure. Beyond sheer quantity, American fuel symbolized a technological gulf as well. U.S. refineries had mastered catalytic cracking, yielding high-octane gasoline more efficiently than Germany's crude hydrogenation plants ever could. American aircraft flew on 100-octane aviation fuel, granting them unmatched performance over Luftwaffe planes that struggled on 87-octane synthetics. American chemists had refined complex additives, tetraethyl lead, ethylene dibromide, detergent compounds, that the Germans could not replicate. Even captured American gasoline sometimes ran poorly in German engines, designed for inferior grades. Fuel, or the lack of it, defined every soldier's experience in that frozen winter. For the Americans, it was an afterthought. For the Germans, it was the difference between motion and paralysis, between life and collapse. Wilhelm Kirsting later testified, "We had skilled surgeons and plenty of American medical supplies, but no fuel for our ambulances. Men died who could have been saved if we'd had enough gasoline to move them 10 kilometers." That realization, dying not from wounds but from emptiness, struck harder than any shell. The discoveries made during the Ardennes shattered years of German propaganda. Soldiers who had been taught to see Americans as weak, decadent, and undisciplined now stood face to face with a power so vast it could destroy what Germany could no longer produce. On December 28th, Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary, "Reports indicate serious morale problems. Soldiers are writing about American superiority. The narrative is crumbling." No censorship could contain the truth. The myth of German invincibility disintegrated the moment it collided with the reality of American logistics. After the failure of the Ardennes, Germany had nothing left but defensive desperation. At Nuremberg, General Alfred Jodl testified bluntly, "After the Ardennes, we knew the war was lost. We had played our final card and found that the enemy held all the aces." The Allies, recognizing the collapse, intensified their focus on fuel production. By February 1945, German synthetic plants were silent. The Luftwaffe had ceased flying, its pilots grounded not by defeat but by thirst. Training programs were canceled, and the once mobile Wehrmacht had turned to stone, destroyed piece by enemies who never stopped moving. Spring 1945 brought surreal scenes across Germany. Entire divisions surrendered without firing a shot. Not from lack of courage, but from lack of gasoline. General Major Fritz Bollian recalled bitterly, "We had 42 tanks, trained crews, and full ammunition loads, but only 300 liters of fuel, not enough to reach the next town. We destroyed our tanks and marched to captivity." Across the front, American columns moved endlessly forward, slowed only by traffic jams from their own vehicle abundance. Patton's Third Army alone fielded over 15,000 vehicles, an empire of motion. Kampfgruppe Peiper's fuel crisis was more than a tactical failure. It was a revelation. When Peiper stood among those captured jerry cans at Honsfeld that frozen December morning, he wasn't just seizing fuel, he was glimpsing the truth that would define the rest of the war. The Germans were fighting an enemy whose waste exceeded their need, whose strength lay not merely in weapons but in the boundless power to sustain them. The numbers told the entire story. German fuel allocation for the offensive, 5 million gallons. Fuel deliberately destroyed by the Americans, 8 million gallons. Daily U.S. consumption in Europe, 7.5 million gallons. Peiper's miraculous haul at Honsfeld, 50,000 gallons, amounted to just 0.6% of what the Americans used in a single day. The Battle of the Bulge claimed the lives of 19,000 Americans and perhaps 100,000 Germans, obliterating the Wehrmacht's final reserves. Yet its most enduring consequence was not military, it was psychological. Through the smoke and fire of the Ardennes, Germany's soldiers finally understood what their leaders never could, that America's strength was not in its armies alone, but in the bottomless abundance that fueled them. Peiper's discovery at Honsfeld was not merely about gasoline, it was the moment industrial warfare revealed its true nature. Victory in the modern age belonged to those who could produce the most, petroleum, steel, aluminum, not those who fought the hardest. By that measure, Germany had never truly stood a chance. The final irony came after the battle, when American forces cataloging the wreckage at L'Église discovered 39 intact Tiger and Panther tanks, abandoned not from damage, but from thirst. Major Robert Harrison's salvage report recorded the finding with bureaucratic precision. Fuel required, 8,000 gallons. Classification, minimal. Source, local reserve, time, 4 hours. What had been impossible for Peiper, 8,000 gallons to save his finest armor, was a trivial logistical note for the Americans, a minor allocation from local reserves greater than Kampfgruppe Peiper's total peak supply. That was the lesson of Honsfeld. Not merely that America possessed more fuel, but that its abundance existed on a scale so vast that German scarcity no longer mattered. The war had been lost long before the Ardennes offensive began. When American industry mobilized, the outcome was sealed. Honsfeld only revealed what had been true since 1942, that Germany was fighting an unwinnable war, measuring defeat in gallons while America measured victory in oceans. Today, Peiper's Tiger tank still rests at L'Église, its fuel gauge frozen at empty. A silent monument to the moment when tactical brilliance collided with logistical reality and was defeated. Visitors often ask why such formidable machines were left behind. The answer remains as stark and simple as ever. There was no fuel.